There are moments in life when we pray and heaven seems silent. We ask, we knock, we seek, and yet no answer comes. The days stretch into weeks, the weeks into years, and we begin to wonder if God has forgotten us. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever walked through a season where every door remained closed, where every effort seemed fruitless? You reach out for something only to grasp the empty air of uncertainty. But I tell you this, silence is not the absence of God. Delay is not denial. The waiting is not wasted. Think about the stillness before the dawn. The world holds its breath in darkness, but the sun is never late. It rises at the appointed time, not a moment too soon, not a second too late. And so it is with God's timing in our lives. We may feel as though we are wandering in the wilderness, but the wilderness has a purpose. God is not ignoring you. He is preparing you. A seed does not grow the moment it is planted. It disappears beneath the soil, buried in darkness, unseen by the world. Days pass, then weeks, then months. To the impatient eye, it seems as though nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, life is stirring. Roots are forming. Strength is being built where no one can see. And when the time is right, when the roots are deep enough, when the stem is strong enough, then and only then does it break through the earth and reach toward the sun. My friends, some of you are in that hidden season right now. You are planted, not buried. You are growing even when you can't see it. And just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. Joseph was given a dream, but before the dream was fulfilled, he was thrown into a pit. He was sold as a slave. He was falsely accused. He was thrown into prison. Years passed. If Joseph had judged God's faithfulness by his circumstances, he might have thought the dream was a lie, but God wasn't finished yet. The delay was not punishment, it was preparation. And when the time came, Joseph didn't just step into his destiny, he was ready for it. And what about David? Anointed as king while still a boy, yet he did not take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years fleeing from Saul, hiding in caves, learning how to trust God in the wilderness before he ever sat upon a throne. Why? Because the waiting shaped him. The delay refined him. And when the time was right, he was not just a man with a crown, he was a king with the heart of a shepherd. My friends, God is not slow. He is never late. What you see as delay may be the very thing ensuring your future blessing doesn't become a burden. A gift given too soon can crush instead of uplift. A calling embraced too early can break rather than build. What if the very thing you're waiting for is being perfected in the unseen? What if the delay is part of the design? You may feel forgotten, but I promise you this, your story is not over. The same God who placed the stars in the heavens, who commands the tides, who orchestrates the seasons, is the same God who holds your life in his hands. He does not overlook his children. He does not abandon his promises. So do not be discouraged. Do not grow weary in the waiting. You are not alone and you are not forgotten. The silence is not empty. It is full of purpose. And when the moment comes, when the door finally opens, when the breakthrough arrives, you will see what God was doing all along, and you will say, it was worth the wait. Life moves in seasons, and every season has its purpose. But we often struggle with God's timing because we see life through the narrow window of our own desires. We want things now, answers, breakthroughs, blessings. We pray, and when the answer doesn't come immediately, we begin to wonder if God has forgotten us. We look around and see others stepping into their victories, and we ask, Lord, when will it be my turn? But my friends, have you ever stopped to think that time is not in your hand? Time belongs to God. He is the master artist painting the story of your life with strokes of divine wisdom. If you saw a painter working on a masterpiece, would you interrupt him halfway through and say, it doesn't look right yet, just finish it now? Of course not. You would trust the artist to complete what he started because you know that true beauty takes time. And so it is with your life. God is not hurried by human impatience. He is not pressured by the ticking of the clock. He sees the beginning and the end, the whole picture, the full design. And because he loves you, he will not rush his work in you. You may be asking for something now, but what if receiving it too soon would cause harm instead of good? What if the blessing is still being shaped? Or more importantly, what if you are still being shaped? Look at the stories of the Bible. Over and over again, we see that God takes his time because he is more interested in preparing a person than simply providing a blessing. Moses had the call of leadership upon his life, but God sent him to the wilderness for 40 years before he ever stood before Pharaoh. Why? Because the preparation was just as important as the promise. Yet years passed and no child came. He grew old and still God did not move according to human expectations. But when the time was right, when the promise was ready, when Abraham's faith was strong enough to carry it, God fulfilled his word. And Abraham saw what we all must learn. Waiting on God is never wasted time. Think about the seasons of nature. The tree does not bear fruit in winter. The farmer does not harvest in spring. There is a time to plant, a time to grow, and a time to reap. If a farmer rushes the harvest before the crop is ready, he ruins it. If a tree tries to force fruit before it has deep roots, the branches will break under the weight. And yet, how often do we want to rush God's timing in our own lives? We want the fruit before the roots have grown deep. We want the blessing before the character to sustain it has been built. But God in his mercy holds it back, not to harm us, but to protect us. He is waiting until the right moment, the moment when what he has prepared for you will not only bless you, but sustain you. Some of you are in a waiting season right now. You are looking at your life and thinking, God, I don't understand. I don't see the purpose in this delay. But my friends, one day you will look back and see that the timing was perfect. One day you will thank God that he did not give you what you wanted when you wanted it, but instead he gave it when you were truly ready. So trust him. Trust that the artist is still painting, that the author is still writing, that the gardener is still tending to the soil of your life. And when the time is right, when the work is finished, when the masterpiece is complete, you will stand in awe of what he has done. And you will say, now I understand. Now I see. It was always worth the wait. We don't like delays. We see them as obstacles, as roadblocks standing between us and what we desire. We ask God for a blessing, and when it doesn't come on our timeline, we grow restless. We wonder if he has forgotten us or if we did something wrong. But what if I told you that the delay isn't a punishment? What if I told you that it is in fact a sign of his love? There are times when God withholds something from us, not to harm us, but to protect us. There are things we think we're ready for, things we believe we need right now, but God in his wisdom sees what we cannot. He knows the weight of the blessing you're asking for. He knows whether you have the strength to carry it, the wisdom to steward it, the maturity to handle it. And if you don't, if the blessing would break you rather than build you, he will hold it back, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. A parent does not give a child the keys to a car before they have learned how to drive. A teacher does not hand a student a diploma before they have gained the knowledge they need. And God, who is the perfect Father, does not release certain blessings into our lives until we are truly ready to receive them. Look at the story of the Israelites. God rescued them from Egypt, but before they could enter the promised land, they had to go through the wilderness. Not because God wanted to withhold the land from them, but because they weren't ready for it. They still had Egypt in their hearts. They had to unlearn their fear, their doubt, their complaining. They had to learn how to trust the God who delivered them. If they had entered the promised land too soon, they would not have had the faith to possess it. And what about Joseph? He had a dream, a vision of greatness, of leadership. But before that dream was fulfilled, he was thrown into a pit. He was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused. He was locked away in prison. Years passed, and it must have seemed like his life was going in the opposite direction of the promise. But in the waiting, God was preparing him. He was developing wisdom in the pit. He was learning humility in the prison. And when the time came, when the season was right, Joseph didn't just step into his destiny, he was ready for it. Some of you are in that waiting place right now. Some of you are frustrated, wondering why God hasn't opened the door yet, why the opportunity hasn't come, why the prayer hasn't been answered. But have you considered that maybe the delay is for your protection? Maybe God is keeping you from something that would harm you if it came too soon. Maybe He is using this time to prepare you for something even greater than what you imagined. Think about this. If God had given you everything you ever asked for the moment you asked for it, would you have been ready? If He had answered every prayer exactly when you wanted, would it have led to blessing or to burden? Sometimes, in hindsight, we realize that what we once called a disappointment was actually divine protection. God does not withhold good things from His children. But He does give them at the right time, in the right way, when they will serve His purpose and not hinder it. So if you are in a season of waiting, do not be discouraged. The blessing is not denied, it is being refined. And when the time is right, when God sees that you are ready, the door will open. And you will see that the delay was never about withholding. It was always about preparing you for something far greater than you could have imagined. And you will say, now I see. Now I understand. God's timing was perfect all along. Every great story has a waiting season. Every person God has ever used in a mighty way has walked through times when it seemed like nothing was happening, when the promise looked distant, when the dream felt impossible. But my friends, delay does not mean denial. It means development. It means preparation. Think of David. When the prophet Samuel anointed him as king, David didn't step onto a throne the next day. No, he went back to the fields to tend sheep. He waited, and then instead of a crown, he found himself running for his life, hiding in caves, being pursued by Saul. Did that mean the promise was false? Did that mean God had forgotten him? Not at all. The delay was part of the process. The years of waiting weren't wasted. They were shaping him into the king he was meant to be. Because God's plan was never just to give David a throne. It was to give Israel a king with the heart of a shepherd. And then there's Joseph. As a young man, he had a dream. God showed him a vision of greatness, of influence, of leadership. But before he could step into that promise, life seemed to take him in the opposite direction. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. How many times must Joseph have looked around and thought, this isn't what God promised me. This isn't what I saw in my dream. But even in the waiting, God was working. Joseph didn't know it at the time, but every challenge, every hardship, every long year in that prison was preparing him for the day he would stand before Pharaoh, not as a dreamer, but as a ruler. Some of you are in that in-between place right now. You've seen glimpses of what God has for you, but it feels like everything is working against you. You've prayed, you've trusted, and still the breakthrough hasn't come. But hear me today. Delay is not the enemy of your destiny. It is the servant of it. A building with no foundation cannot stand. A tree with no roots cannot bear fruit. And a person without preparation cannot carry the full weight of God's calling. There are things God is doing in you during this season that you may not see yet. He is stretching your faith. He is deepening your wisdom. He is strengthening your character. Because when the door finally opens, when the promise is fulfilled, it won't just be any blessing, it will be a lasting blessing. Think about Jesus. He came to this earth to bring salvation, and yet for 30 years he waited. 30 years of preparation for 3 years of ministry. Why? Because even the Son of God moved according to the divine timeline. Even Jesus waited for the appointed time. If you are growing weary, if you are questioning whether God still sees you, I want to remind you, the greatest stories unfold in perfect time. When God speaks a promise, He does not forget it. When He calls you, He does not change His mind. The waiting is not a detour. It is not a mistake. It is part of the design. And one day when the doors open, when the season shifts, when you step into what God has been preparing for you, you will look back on these waiting years and realize that they were never empty. They were never wasted. They were the very thing that shaped you for the destiny ahead. And you will say, now I see it. The waiting wasn't a delay. It was God's perfect plan all along. We live in a world that moves fast. We want things instantly. Quick answers, immediate results, rapid success. If something takes too long, we assume it's broken. If a prayer isn't answered right away, we wonder if God has forgotten us. But my friends, God is not bound by our clocks. He is not limited by our deadlines. His timing is perfect, even when it feels slow to us. When God makes you wait, it's not because He is withholding good things from you. It's because He is aligning everything for the right moment. You see, when God blesses, He doesn't just bless a moment, He blesses a future. He prepares the blessing so that it lasts, so that it doesn't break you but builds you. And sometimes that means waiting. Think of Noah. God told him to build an ark because a flood was coming. Now, Noah didn't see rain the next day. He didn't see it the next year. Scholars believe it may have taken over 50 years before the first drop of rain ever fell. Can you imagine? Year after year, Noah kept building, kept trusting, kept waiting. People must have mocked him. They must have laughed at the idea of rain when the sky was clear. But Noah knew something they didn't. When God speaks, His word does not fail. And when the time was right, the heavens opened, and Noah's obedience was rewarded. Or look at Hannah. She longed for a child, prayed for a son, year after year. She watched as others received their blessings while she remained barren, but she didn't give up. She kept praying, and when God finally answered, He didn't just give her any son. He gave her Samuel, a prophet who would anoint kings, a man who would shape the history of Israel. Her delay wasn't a denial. It was the foundation for something greater than she had ever imagined. Some of you are waiting right now. You're praying for a breakthrough, for a door to open, for a dream to come to life, and it feels like you've been waiting forever. But I want you to hear this. God's delays are always strategic. When He makes you wait, it's not just about the blessing, it's about the positioning. It's about where He is taking you, how He is preparing you, and who He is shaping you to become. The problem is we often mistake the delay for rejection. We assume silence means abandonment. But God is not inactive in your waiting season. He is working behind the scenes, arranging things in ways you cannot see. The relationships, the opportunities, the resources, everything is coming together in His divine order. Look at the story of Jesus' friend Lazarus. When Lazarus was sick, his sisters sent word to asking him to come and heal him. But Jesus delayed, He waited, and while He waited, Lazarus died. To those watching, it must have seemed like the delay was a mistake, but Jesus knew exactly what He was doing, because when He arrived, He didn't just heal a sick man, He raised a dead man. The delay made room for an even greater miracle. Some of you feel like Lazarus. You feel like time has run out, like the dream is dead, like the delay has cost you everything. But listen to me. God has not forgotten you. Your waiting is not in vain. And when He moves, when He speaks, when He finally calls your name, the thing you thought was over will rise again. So don't lose heart. Don't grow weary. The delay isn't a mistake. It's making way for something greater than you can imagine. And when the blessing finally comes, when the door opens, when the promise is fulfilled, you will stand in awe and say, God was right on time. One day you will understand. One day you will look back on this season, the waiting, the unanswered prayers, the doors that didn't open, and you will see it differently. What seemed like silence was actually God's protection. What felt like delay was really divine preparation. And the blessing you thought would never come will arrive at exactly the right moment, in a way more beautiful than you ever imagined. But right now, in the middle of the waiting, It's hard to see that. Right now, it feels like you've been forgotten. It feels like time is slipping through your fingers while others move forward. You watch friends step into their callings, their relationships, their breakthroughs, while you remain in the same place, praying, hoping, wondering if your time will ever come. Let me tell you something, my friends. God is faithful. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. When he speaks a word, he fulfills it. But he does it in his time, not ours. And when the blessing finally arrives, you will understand why he made you wait. Think of Sarah. God told her that she would bear a son, that she would be the mother of nations. But the years passed and there was no child. She was old. Her body was weak. It seemed impossible. She even laughed at the promise. And yet, when the time was right, when every human effort had failed, God did what only he could do. She held Isaac in her arms and realized that he had never forgotten her. Or look at Simeon, the old man who spent his life waiting for the promised Messiah. God had told him that he would see the Savior before he died, and so he waited. Year after year, he watched and hoped. People probably thought he was crazy, an old man clinging to a promise. But then one day in a crowded temple, a young couple walked in with a newborn baby, and when Simeon saw him, he knew every year of waiting had led to this moment. He held the child in his arms and said, "Now my eyes have seen your salvation." My friends, your eyes will see the goodness of the Lord. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the right time, in the right way, it will come. And when it does, you will understand. The delay will make sense. The closed doors will be explained. The tears you cried in the waiting will turn into tears of joy in the fulfillment. And you will realize that God was never late. He was simply working on a different timeline, one designed for your good. Some of you are still standing in the middle of the unknown. You're still waiting for your own Isaac, your own moment of fulfillment. But I promise you this, you will not wait forever. The God who has been faithful to every generation will be faithful to you. The same God who brought Joseph out of the prison, the same God who fulfilled his word to Abraham, the same God who raised Lazarus from the grave, he is the God who is working in your life right now. And when your blessing comes, when the door finally opens, when the prayers are answered, when you see the full picture, you will look back on every moment of waiting and say, it was worth it. There is a moment coming when everything will make sense. A moment when the pieces of your story, the long nights of prayer, the seasons of waiting, the doors that never seem to open, will come together in a way so beautiful, so precise, that you will stand in awe of what God has done. But right now, in this moment, you may not see it yet. Right now, all you see are the unanswered questions. Right now, all you feel is the weight of waiting. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough and it seems like heaven is silent. Maybe you've watched others receive their blessings while you remain in the same place wondering if your time will ever come. I want to tell you something today. God is not just preparing the blessing for you, he is preparing you for the blessing. There is a purpose in this waiting season, a work being done deep within you that you may not fully understand. Think about an artist painting a masterpiece. If you were to walk into his studio midway through, the canvas might look unfinished, unrecognizable. You might see strokes of color that seem random, lines that don't make sense, but the artist knows exactly what he is doing. He knows the final picture. And if you could wait long enough, if you could stand there until he was finished, you would see the beauty of the design. My friends, your life is that masterpiece. Right now, it may look unfinished. Right now, it may feel like nothing is coming together. But God is still painting. He is still working. And when he is finished, you will see that every delay, every detour, every difficult season was part of the masterpiece he was creating in you. Look at the story of Esther. She was just an orphan girl living an ordinary life when suddenly everything changed. She was taken into the palace. She became queen. But then came the real challenge. Her people were in danger, and she was the only one who could save them. But she didn't see it at first. She didn't understand why she had been placed in the palace until Mordecai spoke these words. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? For such a time as this. Some of you have been wondering why God has placed you where you are, why certain doors have closed, why certain prayers haven't been answered. But what if, like Esther, you are being positioned for a purpose greater than you can see? What if the waiting isn't just about what God is doing for you, but about what he is preparing to do through you? Joseph didn't know that his years in prison would lead him to the palace. Ruth didn't know that her faithfulness in the fields would lead her to a new destiny. Moses didn't know that his years in the wilderness would prepare him to lead a nation. But when the time was right, they each stepped into something far greater than they imagined, and so will you. One day you will look back on this season, the waiting, the wondering, the moments that didn't make sense, and you will see that God's hand was in it all. You will see that nothing was wasted. You will see that every piece of the journey was leading you toward something extraordinary. And when that day comes, you will not only thank God for the blessing, you will thank him for the waiting, because the waiting was the very thing that made you ready. And you will say with confidence, now I understand. God's timing was perfect all along.